Hello and welcome to Occult Book Review. If anyone has seen the movie The Witch, they'll remember the final scene where the main character walks through the woods and discovers a fire and a coven of witches around it, and slowly they begin to rise and levitate, and it expresses very much the popular view of what a witch is. It reinforces the negative stereotypes. So I wanted to try and go against that this week. And it's interesting as well when you go on the IMDb, for example, and you look up movies about witches and paganism. Most movies are expressing that pagans and witches are bad or evil, and it brings up a great argument about the difference between what's dangerous and what's bad, because on the surface, people can mix those things up very, very easily. We'll talk about that again in a second. So the book I've chosen this week, it's actually on my Kindle, if you can see it. It's called Hedge, and it's by Harmonia Saille, and it's from Moon Books. And another reason why I wanted to choose this particular book is because I've had quite a few conversations over the past couple of weeks about the difference between shamanism and hedge riding. So this particular book explores those differences in quite good detail, and it's what you might call a popular pagan book, but it's no less worthwhile for being that. So what is hedge riding? Hedge riding is a form of spiritual travel, of shamanic travel, I suppose some people would call it. I know some people want to be quite specific, and they want to separate hedge riding and shamanic travel into different disciplines, and that's fair enough. The author in this book does distinguish here as well, and she talks particularly about the difference between Western shamanism and indigenous shamanism. And one of the main arguments, of course, is whether or not a person can even be taught how to hedge ride, or whether or not they have to go through some kind of ordeal or be initiated into a particular tradition in order to do so. This also ties into chapters later on in the book where the author talks about particular ointments and entheogens and ways in which you can push yourself through those veils, if you like, and push further through your own personal cosmology into what the author says is the realm of hedge riding, which is the collective unconsciousness. In the lead up to making this particular video, I was reading Sarah Ann Lawless's blog post about hedge riding as well, and she also echoes those sentiments about distinguishing between your own imagination and what you want to believe and what is actual the kind of breaking the veil, if you like. I was reminded a lot, actually, this is kind of going off topic, but in a way it's not. If anyone has read His Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman, and in particular the second book, The Subtle Knife, where the character Will has to use a knife in which to break through different into different worlds, and what he does is he reaches out with the knife and he feels the kind of the weak or the fragile boundaries, and then when he actually can get a grasp on it, he can cut his way through worlds. So in some ways, particularly when you're talking about hedge riding being induced by trance or rhythm, there's a similarity there, I felt anyway. The author of this book has spent many years in the tradition of the Circle of Anya, and for the last 12 years in particular, she's focused on hedge riding and hedge witchery. She talks about a lot of things that are very pertinent and very controversial. And she does it in a way you can tell that there are times where she's apprehensive and she's reluctant to divulge too much, and she's certainly reluctant to be seen to be influencing anyone else's opinions and interpretations. She talks a lot about the importance of personal cosmology and the importance of practice when it comes to hedge riding. I suppose one of the main questions, and this turns up all of the time now in the occult, the whole idea of appropriation. Is it better to use local deities and spirits, or what happens if you have a particular attraction or an affinity with something outside of your own cultural forms? In that context, do you ignore that, or do you actually work with it? And in the author's case, she decided to work with it. She talks quite a lot about her own heritage, her connections to Norse forms, but also North American forms. And she expresses quite openly that she doesn't know why, in some cases, she has particular totem guides. She doesn't know why she has particular spirit guides. She says at one point that she thought that her totem for hedge riding would be a small, fleet-footed creature, and in the end, she actually ends up being accompanied by an ox, and she's confused about this. But for the author, it shows the authenticity of her own experience and the fact that she did break through her own personal. The author is very careful to express the fact that the book is her own opinion and the result of her own journeying and her own hedge riding. And in that context, she says that hedge riding is usually a solitary practice, but there are instances when people have had group sessions, I suppose you might call them, and they have come back with shared symbols and shared messages. She also talks about the fact that hedge riding is not usually involved with psychopomp work, which I thought was very interesting, and it was a good way to distinguish, if people really wanted to, if you can distinguish hedge riding from shamanism in that context. One of the most important themes in the book is about how you are responsible for how good you become at hedge riding based on your own acceptance of magic in your own life. And in this context, she talks about accepting syncs and noticing strange occurrences, and she gives good practical examples. She gives lots of recipes. She gives path working, gives accounts of her own path working journeys, and she talks about practical things like making a dream journal, for example. And this is in order to push yourself nearer to your unconscious self, you know, to draw the spiritual world and the physical world closer together so that the boundary between worlds is more blurred, and it makes it easier when you do go to hedge ride to kind of transition from one state. It's full of practical advice. There are protection spells, there are examples of particular types of incense are useful. The author gives accounts of her own hedge riding journeys, and I suppose she, as I've already mentioned, she does talk about how people need to be careful when they hedge ride. It's not something to take on lightly, and the author says a few times she's not even sure if maybe she has a gift for it and it's not something that someone else can be taught. You can certainly practice it, and it may well, like mindfulness or meditation, be beneficial to you. Ultimately, you need to be psychologically strong to do it, and this brings us back to what I was talking about at the start of the video, that difference between what is dangerous and what is bad. The difference between pushing yourself through boundaries and saying no to the status quo and willfully wanting harm to be done against someone. And this is where the kind of Hollywood witch goes against real witchcraft in my ideas anyway. I was reminded very much of, if anyone has read Peter Gray's book, Lucifer Princeps, his idea of conditioned rebellion. And that kind of, it kept coming into my mind when I was reading this particular book, even though this book, Hedge Riding, is a lighter book. In some ways, the theme is quite similar. It's about what are the consequences of going against the norm, if you like. So that concludes this particular occult book review. The book is Hedge Riding, if you can see it there. It's by Harmonia Saille, and it's quite a good price on Kindle anyway. And it's well worth reading. It's full of practical advice. It's full of protection. It's full of the author's own personal insights. So I'll see you next week for another occult book review. Thanks.